17 miles southwest of St. Louis, there's a state park where people jog, bike, and have picnics on summer afternoons. It's peaceful, it's pretty, and underneath their feet, buried in a mound at the center of the park, are the incinerated remains of an entire American town. Its houses, its businesses, its water tower, the accumulated belongings of 2,000 people, all burned and buried because the ground they sat on was too poisonous to touch. The park is called Route 66 State Park. The town it replaced was called Times Beach. Times Beach, Missouri, was the site of one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. A town that asked for nothing more than a solution to dusty roads and got a chemical weapon sprayed on its streets instead. A town that was poisoned slowly, quietly, for over a decade, while the people responsible said nothing. And a town that was ultimately erased entirely, not by war, not by a natural disaster, but by a single decision made in a locked hotel conference room. This is the story of how an ordinary American community disappeared, and why the people who caused it never paid a price. Times Beach began as a newspaper promotion in 1925, when the old St. Louis Times began offering subscribers an enticing deal. For $67.50, they would get a 6-month subscription, plus a tiny lot in a summer resort next to the Merrimack River. It wasn't glamorous. In its early years, the town was primarily a summer resort, but the Great Depression combined with gasoline rationing during World War II reduced the feasibility of summer homes. The town became a community of mostly low-income housing. People who had come for weekends ended up staying forever. They built small homes on small lots, opened diners and taverns, raised children, and put down roots in the kind of community that doesn't make the news. Quiet, tight-knit, overlooked, and entirely ordinary. The town had many family-owned businesses, like Cash's Tavern, Whiteway Food Market, and Steiny's Inn, where a diner could order a steak dinner for $2.50. Route 66, the most famous road in America, ran right through the southern edge of town. Travelers stopped for gas and food. Kids grew up swimming in the Merrimack River. It wasn't paradise, but it was home. There was one persistent problem, though. The community lacked paved roads. Drier weather meant clouds of dust as people drove about the community. Unpaved roads were a maintenance headache and a daily nuisance. Dust on windshields, dust in homes, dust in lungs. And Times Beach, like dozens of small American towns at the time, didn't have the money to pave them. So in 1972, town officials found what seemed like a perfectly reasonable solution. They hired a man named Russell Bliss to spray the roads with oil. Russell Bliss got the oil for free the year before, when a chemical manufacturer that had made most of its money selling napalm to the military paid him to get rid of its waste materials. He mixed 6 truckloads of that waste, which turned out to be hexachlorophene tainted with dioxin, a dangerous chemical that, once absorbed, can remain in the human body for more than 10 years, with a tank full of used motor oil. What the city didn't know is that Bliss had subcontracted to haul waste for the Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company, NEPACCO, which operated a facility in Verona, Missouri. During the Vietnam War, this facility had been a producer of Agent Orange, and the waste removed from the plant contained levels of dioxin some 2,000 times higher than the dioxin content in Agent Orange itself. Bliss later claimed he had no idea any of this was in his tanks. The children of Times Beach loved sliding around in Bliss's purple-tinted goo, and no one gave the substance a second thought. That image is almost impossible to sit with. Children playing in it, parents watching, unbothered, a whole town going about its life, completely unaware that one of the most toxic chemicals ever synthesized was soaking into the ground beneath them, into the dust they breathed, into the soil their children played in every single day. The spraying continued across 23 miles of unpaved streets. And then slowly, things started going wrong. In 1971, the CDC responded to reports of widespread unexplained deaths of horses, birds, and other small animals, as well as acute poisoning symptoms, headaches, nosebleeds, stomach pain, diarrhea, and skin rashes experienced by people living around properties where Bliss had sprayed. Arena owner Judy Piatt, who had hired Bliss to spray her horse stables, began following his trucks. She eventually uncovered the connection to the toxic waste. She and her daughters were later diagnosed with chronic systemic chemical poisoning from inhalation, skin absorption, and ingestion of dioxin, and suffered from a range of disorders. Piatt reported what she found. The CDC began investigating. Soil tests came back showing elevated dioxin levels at several locations. But the government's response was slow, cautious, and deeply bureaucratic. Times Beach officials called the EPA, but it said it might be a year before it would be able to test. We didn't like that because people were building new homes. Businesses were locating there, said Marilyn Leisner, who would later become the town's mayor. People were still moving in, still building, still raising families on streets soaked in poison, and the agencies that knew something was wrong couldn't find the urgency to tell them. Then came November 1982. A reporter called the city clerk with a question that changed everything. He had acquired an official document detailing suspected dioxin sites across Missouri. Did Times Beach officials know their city was high on the list? Well, no. A decade had passed since the spraying, and the people of Times Beach were only now learning what had been done to their town. But even as they tried to process that news, something worse was coming. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began warning people in low-lying areas that a severe flood was coming. Sometimes beach residents evacuated, but many defiantly stayed. The bank that stood between the town and the river was steep and tall. People doubted that the water would even make it to Riverside Drive. They were wrong. On December 5th, the river jumped its banks, and quickly the entire town was submerged. Houses were ripped from their foundations. Trailers were tossed about like bumper boats. Flood stage was 18.5 feet, and the water crested at nearly 43 feet. It was described as a 500-year flood. The timing was catastrophic. The EPA had just finished taking soil samples the day before the flood hit. Now, as the floodwaters spread across every street, every yard, every inch of Times Beach, they were carrying dioxin with them, mixing it into everything, pushing it into walls, into foundations, into the Merrimack River itself. People who had fled in advance of the flooding were advised not to return. People who had not yet returned were told not to come back. 3 days before Christmas, the EPA announced it had identified dangerous levels of dioxin in Times Beach's soil. Panic spread through the town, with many illnesses, miscarriages, and animal deaths attributed to the dioxin. At the time, dioxin was hailed as the most toxic chemical synthesized by man. Dioxin levels in the town were found to be 300 times what the CDC considered safe. 300 times. In the streets where children had played. In the dust those same children had breathed for a decade. The government's response came fast once the story went national. Speaking from a locked conference room in a hotel near Times Beach, EPA Administrator Ann Burford announced that the EPA would buy out 800 residential properties and 30 businesses using Superfund dollars. It was the first time in American history that the federal government had purchased and evacuated an entire town due to chemical contamination. 800 families had to leave their lives completely behind. They were told to take their personal belongings and go. Many of them never went back. Former resident Frank Perler remembered the moment men in chemical suits appeared in people's front yards, taking soil samples. People were looking out their windows like, "What in the world is going on?" he said. That's when everybody really found out. To do that to somebody, still to this day, I don't get that. Eventually, there was only one couple left living in the town, George and Laureen Klein. People magazine profiled their last stand. They held out as long as they could, but by 1985, Times Beach's entire population of well over 2,000 residents had been relocated, and Governor John Ashcroft issued an executive order for the town's disincorporation. A town of 2,000 people, gone. Not from war, not from famine, not from anything the residents chose or caused. Gone because a waste hauler mixed the wrong tanks together and a chemical company let him. And here's the thing that makes this story different from a simple tragedy. Bliss was never implicated or convicted of a crime. As to the lawsuits involving the chemical companies, no laws were in effect that regulated hazardous waste disposal at the time of disposal. Nobody went to prison. The corporations settled lawsuits quietly, out of court. In 1992 alone, the chemical companies reached out-of-court settlements with 381 people who had filed dioxin lawsuits. The terms were not disclosed. And there is one more twist to this story that almost nobody talks about. Today, researchers remain divided on just how toxic dioxin really is, leading to speculation as to whether the town's evacuation was even necessary. Even Russell Bliss, the man at the center of the crisis, appears to have suffered no ill effects from his exposure to the substance. Subsequent studies of potentially exposed people from Times Beach revealed no adverse health outcomes, that can be directly linked to dioxin. No cases of chlorachin, a common symptom of acute dioxin poisoning, were observed in Times Beach residents, nor any increased prevalence of any other disease. So, was the evacuation necessary? Was a town of 2,000 people erased unnecessarily? There's no clean answer. Former resident Perler said he isn't 100% sure of the cause of the cancer he developed, but he believes living at Times Beach played a part. Former Mayor Marilyn Leisner knows former residents who developed thyroid disorders and cancer, including some of her own family members. What happened next is stranger still. Since Times Beach contained over 50% of the dioxin in the state of Missouri, it became the logical choice for the placement of a massive incinerator. That incinerator eventually treated 265,354 tons of dioxin-contaminated materials from 27 eastern Missouri dioxin sites. Homes, businesses, and even the town water tower were incinerated. The remains were buried in what they call a town mound. A town mound, a single hill of ash where 2,000 people's lives used to be. The cleanup cost an estimated $200 million, paid for by taxpayers. The chemical companies that created the dioxin, that stored it in tanks and paid someone else to make it disappear, contributed a fraction of that. In 1999, the state of Missouri opened Route 66 State Park on the former site of Times Beach. Hiking trails now run through what used to be residential streets. A fawn ambled across the road on a recent summer evening as cyclists pedaled past the town mound. It's a beautiful park, it really is. Those who know what to look for can discover small reminders of the town of Times Beach. The park's visitor center is located in the only Times Beach building left standing, the former Bridgehead Inn, or one can walk the mound in the park, the spot where the incinerated buildings and belongings of the people of Times Beach are buried. And every year, former residents come back. They gather on the site to see old friends, tell stories, and inevitably shed a few tears. Everyone in attendance says that if the town were reopened tomorrow, they would move back in a heartbeat. They hold reunions on the grave of their own town. Marilyn Leisner, the woman who became Times Beach's last mayor and its most persistent voice, received a late-night message in 2023 from a stranger in Ohio, a resident concerned about her community after the toxic train derailment in East Palestine. The stranger had found a 1992 documentary about Times Beach online. For hours, the two women shared stories across 600 miles and 4 decades. That connection says everything about Times Beach that needs to be said. What happened there wasn't unique. It wasn't a one-time failure of an otherwise reliable system. It was the predictable result of a society that treated chemical waste disposal as someone else's problem, handed it to a middleman, asked no questions, and moved on. The people of Times Beach asked for paved roads or something close to it, a simple, reasonable request from a modest community that just wanted to breathe clean air. Instead, they got a decade of silent poisoning, a Christmas morning announcement that their town was uninhabitable, and a bill for $200 million that they didn't pay. The corporations paid a fraction, settled quietly, disclosed nothing. The Times Beach tragedy brought dioxin to national attention and pushed for the passing of new environmental laws regulating waste disposal. New rules were written. The Superfund program was strengthened. America learned officially that it needed to keep track of where it put its poison. But the lesson Times Beach actually teaches isn't about waste disposal regulations. It's about who bears the cost of cutting corners. It's always the people with the least power in the smallest towns, with the dirtiest roads and the thinnest margins, who end up living and dying inside the decisions made by people who will never set foot in their community. The mound in Route 66 State Park doesn't have a sign. Most visitors bike right past it without knowing what it is. A hill of ash where a town used to be, quietly composting back into the Missouri earth. Times Beach is gone. The companies that poisoned it are not. That's the part worth remembering.